Tom Walsh stood at the threshold of his new life, taking in the salty air of Bayview, a peaceful coastal town in California. The ocean waves crashed rhythmically against the shore as he unlocked the doors to his recently opened diner, the Coastal Refuge. For the locals, it was just a quaint place to grab coffee and pie. But for Tom, it was his best attempt at leaving his past behind, a way to bury the memories of a former life that haunted his thoughts each night. At 42, Tom's life looked simple, perhaps deliberately so. Behind his quiet demeanor, however, lay years of service as a CIA operative. He had been a man whose life was entrenched in shadows, where no one was truly friend or foe, and every day was a battle of survival and wits. Though he had been honorably discharged after a final mission that nearly broke him, Tom knew he would never truly escape that world. He bore the scars, both visible and hidden, that would never heal. His brown eyes, sharp yet guarded, scanned the surroundings whenever he left his diner, and his steps, calm but calculated, betrayed a readiness for threats that could come out of nowhere. Tom's attention was soon drawn to a regular customer who had started visiting the diner with her young son. Kate Miller was a teacher at the local elementary school and a single mother raising her 8-year-old son, David. With every visit, Kate's smile seemed to warm the diner, bringing a sense of normalcy Tom had forgotten. David, bright-eyed and curious, often filled the diner with innocent laughter and questions. As the weeks passed, Kate's gentle demeanor managed to chip away at Tom's walls, and their casual conversations grew deeper. Kate sensed the darkness Tom carried, but rather than pry, she offered a comforting presence. She had a way of asking about his life with subtlety, and Tom found himself giving away small, guarded pieces of himself, though he avoided any mention of his past. One evening, as the sky darkened over Bayview, Tom found himself alone after closing up. He'd noticed that some of the neighboring businesses were already shuttered, and he knew why. It wasn't just that Bayview was quiet after sundown. It was that fear had settled into the town, and the name on everyone's lips was Salvatore "Sal" Mancini. Sal was the town's unspoken tyrant, a mafia leader who controlled much of the local business scene through thinly veiled threats, extortion, and intimidation. His network was vast, his tactics brutal, and his hands reached into every corner of Bayview. Tom had heard the murmurs, seen the way other owners flinched at the mention of Sal's name. But Tom, unwilling to be dragged into someone else's war, had chosen to ignore it, focusing instead on his diner and his newfound peace. Until, of course, it became his problem. It started small. Tom arrived one morning to find his diner's door scratched and marked, a clear sign of vandalism. He brushed it off, thinking it might have been kids or a random incident. But as the week progressed, the incidents continued. Windows were cracked, graffiti appeared on his walls, and strange symbols were carved into the wooden tables. The messages were subtle but unmistakable. They had reached his doorstep. Tom's instincts screamed at him to act, but he forced himself to keep calm. This was the life he had chosen: peace, detachment, simplicity. But peace, it seemed, was more elusive than he had thought. One rainy evening, while cleaning up after the last customer, 2 men entered the diner, ignoring the closed sign on the door. They wore dark jackets, their movements calculated as they approached the counter. The taller of the 2 leaned forward, his gaze piercing as he spoke. "You're Tom Walsh, right?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "We work for Mr. Mancini. He'd like a word." Tom's expression didn't waver as he met the man's gaze, but he felt the tension in his muscles. "I'm closed for the night," he replied evenly, hoping his calm would diffuse the situation. The man smirked. "Mr. Mancini doesn't really care about your hours," he said. "He's just here to make sure you're aware of how things work around here." "I'm aware," Tom replied, his voice a shade cooler. "I don't want trouble. Just here to run my diner." The second man, shorter but with a smug look on his face, chimed in. "Good to hear, because we'd hate to see a nice place like this fall apart." Tom clenched his jaw. He had heard enough veiled threats to recognize one. "Is that so?" he said, keeping his tone even. "I'm not interested in any arrangements, gentlemen. I don't need protection." The taller man's smirk turned to a sneer. "We'll see about that," he murmured, his eyes narrowing as he glanced around the diner. "You'll be hearing from us again, Mr. Walsh." With that, the two men exited, leaving Tom standing alone in the silent diner, the weight of their threats settling heavily on his shoulders. That night, he barely slept. Memories flooded back, memories of dark rooms, whispered threats, and enemies lurking around every corner. He had come to Bayview for peace, but it seemed that peace was slipping through his fingers. Days passed, and Tom tried to focus on his routine, forcing himself to believe that the threats were just bluffs. But deep down, he knew better. The vandalism escalated. One morning, he arrived to find shattered glass all over the floor and the word "Pabe" scrawled across the counter in thick black paint. He cleaned it up in silence, his resolve hardening with every stroke. It wasn't just his livelihood they were threatening now. It was the safety of his small sanctuary, the life he had chosen. As Tom swept up the broken glass, Kate arrived with David, noticing the tension in his face. Concerned, she asked, "Tom, is everything all right?" He paused, forcing a reassuring smile. "Just some trouble with the locals," he replied, downplaying the danger. But Kate sensed his worry, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture of comfort. David, blissfully unaware, continued to chatter, bringing a fleeting smile to Tom's face. He appreciated their presence, their warmth, even though he knew it was dangerous to grow attached. He could feel the walls he had built around himself begin to crack, and he feared for what would come if they were broken completely. But the peace he craved was already slipping away. Tom Walsh's calm resolve was about to be tested. The night after the latest vandalism incident, he locked up the diner, reinforcing doors and checking windows, but he knew it wouldn't stop the trouble. Sal Mancini's grip on Bayview was tightening, and Tom had become a direct target. Mancini was notorious for enforcing loyalty through violence, and Tom's refusal to comply made him the town's latest challenge. The escalating tension wasn't just about money anymore. For Mancini, it had become a matter of principle. He couldn't let a stranger come in and defy his rules without facing consequences. It wasn't long before Sal made his next move. 2 nights later, Tom was closing up when he noticed the faint shadow of figures moving outside. He extinguished the lights inside and carefully approached the door, keeping his presence unnoticed. Through the blinds, he spotted a group of men gathering near the entrance, speaking in low voices. Tom recognized one of them immediately. Vic, the Hammer, Giordano. Vic was one of Sal's most feared enforcers, known for his ruthless methods. They hadn't come for conversation, they'd come to send a message. As Tom opened the door cautiously, Vic smirked, stepping forward with a calculated swagger. "You must think you're real tough, huh?" he sneered, cracking his knuckles. "Not paying respect to the man who keeps this town running?" Tom kept his voice level, hiding the frustration boiling underneath. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling. I'm here to run my business, that's it." Vic's eyes glinted with a sinister amusement. "See, that's your problem, Walsh. You think this place is some kind of sanctuary. But in this town, there's only one way things go. And when you don't pay, things get ugly." Without another word, Vic nodded to his men. They moved swiftly, smashing the windows, ripping apart chairs, and kicking over tables. The crash of glass and splintering would fill the diner as Tom watched, restraining himself from reacting. He clenched his fists, feeling the old instincts kicking in. But he knew if he attacked, there would be no turning back. Just then, Kate appeared outside, looking in horror at the chaos unfolding inside the diner. "Tom," she called, her voice breaking through the noise. Vic turned to look at her, and a sinister grin spread across his face. "Ah, looks like you've got yourself an audience," he sneered. "Maybe she'd like to see what happens when someone steps out of line." Tom's voice dropped, calm but cold. "You touch her, and I'll make you regret it." Vic laughed, unimpressed. Is that right? You don't seem to understand, Walsh. In Bayview, we don't take no for an answer. One of Vic's men moved toward Kate, clearly aiming to intimidate her, but before he could reach her, Tom stepped in, blocking his path. The man sneered, raising his fists, but Tom moved with a deadly precision, grabbing the man's arm, twisting it, and forcing him to his knees. It was a controlled, efficient takedown, one that hinted at the combat training he'd worked so hard to leave behind. Vic and his remaining men were momentarily stunned, but then Vic's face contorted with fury. "You want to fight, huh?" he roared, lunging at Tom. What followed was a brutal, chaotic brawl. Tom dodged Vic's punches, countering with quick, calculated strikes. Chairs became makeshift shields, and broken table legs turned into impromptu weapons. Vic's men attempted to overpower Tom, but his training kept him one step ahead, using their own momentum against them. Tom fought silently, focused, and lethal, each move a reminder of a past he'd tried to forget. By the time the last of Sal's men retreated, Vic was on the floor, gasping for breath, clutching his bruised ribs. He glared up at Tom with a mixture of pain and seething hatred. "You're a dead man, Walsh," he spat. "Sal's not gonna let this go." Tom looked down at him, his voice calm but resolute. "Tell Sal he picked the wrong man to threaten." As the men staggered out, Kate rushed to Tom's side, her face etched with worry and fear. "Tom, are you all right? What was that?" He nodded, catching his breath. "Just some locals trying to make a point." But as he looked at her, he saw the concern in her eyes and realized the depth of the danger they were both in. "Why didn't you call the police?" she pressed. "They need to know what's happening." Tom shook his head, his gaze turning hard. "The police here won't do a thing. Most of them are on Sal's payroll. If I'd called, it'd only make things worse." Kate hesitated, sensing the weight behind his words. She knew there was more to Tom than he let on, but she didn't push. Instead, she placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to face this alone, Tom. I'm here if you need anything." For a moment, Tom allowed himself to feel the comfort of her presence, but he knew the reality they faced. With Sal now viewing him as a personal challenge, the situation was far from over. As Kate left reluctantly, he locked up the diner, his thoughts clouded by the certainty that things would escalate. True to Vic's word, the retaliation came quickly. Over the following days, customers began to avoid the coastal refuge, intimidated by the Mafia's warning. Tom's business suffered, the once bustling diner growing emptier each day. Flyers warning people not to associate with him appeared around town, and Kate, fearing for David's safety, visited less frequently. The isolation weighed heavily on Tom, but it also reignited a fire he'd thought was long gone. That night, as he sat alone, the diner quiet and dark, he felt the weight of his old life pressing down. He knew it was only a matter of time before Sal came for him personally. And when that happened, there would be no holding back. Tom resumed his training in secret, testing the limits of his strength, honing skills that had once made him a ghost in the field. The battle lines were drawn, and Tom was ready to defend the life he had built with every last ounce of strength. He had come to Bayview for peace, but if war was what Sal wanted, Tom would ensure he was prepared for it. As Tom Walsh's defiance against Sal Mancini's Mafia deepened, so did the haunting memories of his past. Each night brought fractured images, faces he couldn't save, choices that lingered like scars. Alone in his darkened room, Tom's mind wandered back to one particular mission, a covert operation that had gone horribly wrong, leaving him to make choices he'd never forgive himself for. Those choices had been his undoing, pushing him out of the CIA and into a life he'd hoped would offer some kind of peace. But now, it seemed his past was catching up, dragging him back into a world he'd left behind. The attacks on his diner continued, but with greater cruelty. Windows smashed, graffiti appeared overnight, and his regular customers vanished, afraid of the consequences of associating with him. The diner, once a place of hope, felt like a prison, each crack and splinter a reminder of the trap tightening around him. Kate Miller noticed the shift in Tom's demeanor. She'd long suspected that his quiet resilience masked a deep well of pain, and now that pain seemed to rise to the surface, filling his gaze with an emptiness she couldn't ignore. She knew Tom was being targeted and felt helpless watching him face it alone. One evening, she approached him in the nearly empty diner, where he sat lost in thought, the weight of exhaustion clear in his eyes. "Tom," she said softly, pulling up a chair across from him. "Whatever this is that's haunting you, you don't have to face it by yourself." Tom forced a small smile, but the usual warmth in his eyes was gone. "Kate, there are things in my past that I can't explain, things I can't make right," he admitted, his voice low and rough. "People got hurt because of me. People who trusted me." Kate placed a comforting hand over his. "You came here to find peace, Tom. Maybe it's time to let someone help you carry that weight." But Tom turned his gaze to the table, his jaw clenched. "I appreciate it, Kate, but there are parts of me that even I can't face." They sat in silence, a shared understanding passing between them. Kate could see the toll that this conflict was taking on him, and while she wished she could do more, she knew pushing him would only build more walls. She squeezed his hand, a silent promise that she would be there if he needed her. Meanwhile, Sal Mancini's own investigation into Tom had taken an unexpected turn. One of Sal's informants had come across a classified record suggesting that Tom's past involved something far more dangerous than running a small-town diner. The details were vague, shrouded in blacked-out government files, but they pointed to a man who had once worked against Sal's own interests, a man whose actions had led to the capture of Sal's younger brother years before. The revelation ignited a deeply personal vendetta in Sal. This wasn't just about forcing another merchant to pay up, it was revenge. Tom Walsh was the enemy who had torn his family apart, and Sal's desire to make him suffer became an obsession. He began targeting not just Tom but the people around him. Sal's men left threatening notes on Kate's doorstep and ominous warnings directed at her son, David. The message was clear. Tom's defiance was no longer an isolated act. Everyone he cared about was now fair game. When Tom learned of the threats against Kate and David, a dark fury welled up inside him, one he hadn't felt in years. Protecting the innocent had been a core part of his training, and though he had abandoned that life, he hadn't abandoned that instinct. Kate and David had come to mean something to him, a small but vital connection to a world where he didn't have to be the ruthless operative he once was. After a sleepless night, Tom made a decision. The attacks had crossed a line, and there would be no more avoiding the inevitable. He dusted off the gear he'd hidden away, supplies from a time he thought he'd never need again. He began training intensely, pushing his body and mind to their limits, focusing on every movement, every technique that had once made him a deadly force in the field. The discipline, the focus, it all returned with shocking ease, as if his past self had been lying dormant, waiting to be reawakened. As he prepared, Tom also put a plan into motion, one that would turn Sal's tactics against him. Over the next few days, he moved through Bayview quietly, reconnecting with locals who had once looked up to him. He spoke with a few remaining business owners who had suffered under Sal's grip, offering them the protection they so desperately needed. For the first time, the community began to fight back, empowered by Tom's resolve. Even as he did this, Tom was aware that it would provoke Sal further, but he was ready. The fear had melted away, replaced by a steely determination to end Sal's reign over Bayview. On the eve of his confrontation, Kate found him at the diner, where he was meticulously setting up the space in a way that seemed almost strategic. She approached him, worry etched across her face. "Tom, what are you planning?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, the hard resolve in his eyes softened just slightly. "I'm making sure this ends, Kate. Sal and his men aren't going to leave on their own. Someone has to push them out." She shook her head, fear and concern evident. "This isn't what you came here for. You deserve better than this fight." Tom gave her a faint, sad smile. "Sometimes, you don't get to choose what follows you, Kate. I wanted peace, but it seems that part of me never really left. Kate took his hands, her gaze intense. Then promise me you'll be careful. David and we need you here, Tom. This town needs you. Tom nodded, feeling a rare warmth in the midst of his preparations. I promise, he said, though they both knew there was no guarantee he'd return. That night, he stood alone in the empty diner, feeling a familiar weight settle over him, an old friend he had hoped he'd never see again. But this time, he welcomed it. Sal Mancini had tried to break him, to strip him of everything he had rebuilt, but Tom knew that what he had in Bayview, his fragile new life, his connection with Kate and David, was worth fighting for. The past he had tried so hard to leave behind was now his weapon, and he would wield it with all the skill and precision he once had. This fight was personal, and he was ready for whatever came next. The air in Bayview felt heavier that night, as if the town itself sensed the storm about to break. Tom Walsh waited behind the counter of his diner, every movement deliberate, his senses sharp and focused. It was late, the coastal refuge quiet but for the low hum of the refrigerator. His preparations were complete. He'd secured the entrances, arranged the tables strategically, and kept a weapon hidden within reach. This time, he wasn't just defending his diner. He was taking a stand, putting an end to Sal Mancini's reign over Bayview once and for all. The door swung open with a violent crash, shattering the stillness. Sal entered first, his face twisted in a smirk of arrogant malice. Behind him came 6 men, including Vic Giordano, each one armed and scanning the diner with looks of vicious anticipation. Customers were scattered around, some frozen in shock and fear. Among them, Tom saw Kate and David huddled near the corner, their eyes wide with dread. His heart tightened at the sight of them, but he kept his focus. Well, Walsh, Sal drawled, pacing forward with a chilling calm. You didn't think I'd forget what you did to my brother, or that I'd let some washed-up ghost come in and embarrass me in my own town. Tom met Sal's gaze with icy resolve. This isn't about your brother. This is about your grip on innocent people. You've squeezed this town dry, and it ends tonight. Sal chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. Brave words for a man with no backup, he sneered. I don't think you realize who you're dealing with. Tom's jaw tightened. I know exactly who you are, Sal. A man who hides behind threats and guns, terrorizing families to feel powerful. That ends here. With a sharp nod, Sal signaled his men forward. They began to fan out, blocking the exits, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Sal himself took a step back, his smirk unwavering as he watched, waiting for Tom to beg or cower. But Tom was done running. In an instant, he sprang into action, his years of training guiding each movement with lethal precision. The first man lunged at him, and Tom sidestepped, grabbing a metal tray from the counter and swinging it with brutal force. The man staggered, clutching his head, and Tom used the distraction to disarm him, wrenching the gun from his hand and tossing it across the room. The next attacker swung a metal baton, but Tom ducked, countering with a quick, punishing blow to the ribs. He moved fluidly, his every step a calculated maneuver honed through years of covert operations. Tables and chairs became shields as Tom used the diner's layout to his advantage, ducking behind counters, deflecting attacks, and using anything within reach as a weapon. He fought with a raw, silent ferocity, his past training seamlessly blending with the rage that had built up over the weeks of Sal's attacks. It wasn't just about survival, it was about reclaiming the life he had tried so hard to build. In the midst of the chaos, Vic Giordano charged forward, brandishing a knife. Tom met his gaze, their silent hatred igniting in a clash that was as brutal as it was personal. Vic slashed, but Tom deflected, catching his wrist and twisting it until the knife clattered to the floor. They grappled, Vic snarling and cursing as Tom overpowered him, pinning him against a table. In a final decisive move, Tom delivered a crushing blow to Vic's jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground, unconscious. 2 of Sal's men rushed at Tom from opposite sides, one armed with a bat, the other with a chain. Tom was outnumbered but undeterred. He grabbed a nearby chair, using it to shield himself from the bat swing, then turned, slamming it into the man with the chain. The force of the impact sent the man reeling, and Tom disarmed him, swiftly subduing him with a series of calculated strikes. Amidst the wreckage of overturned tables and shattered glass, Tom turned his attention to Sal, who had remained in the background, watching the scene unfold with growing rage. Sal's confident smirk had faded, replaced by a look of raw hatred. He pulled a gun from his coat, aiming it at Tom with a steady hand. "Enough," Sal hissed. "This is where it ends, Walsh. Say goodbye to your diner, to your life, to everything." Tom stood still, his eyes locked on Sal's, unflinching. "If you're going to pull that trigger, Sal, you better be ready for what comes next." Sal's finger hovered over the trigger, his hand shaking slightly as the room fell into tense silence. But before he could act, Kate's voice broke through the tension. "Stop!" she cried, stepping forward with David clutching her hand tightly. Her voice was trembling, but her gaze was defiant. "You don't have to do this." Sal's gaze flickered to her, a sneer forming on his lips. "This isn't your fight, lady. You and the kid should have kept your distance." Kate held her ground, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "You think you can come into this town and bully everyone, but people are stronger than you realize. Tom's stronger than you realize." For a moment, the room held its breath. Sal's grip tightened on the gun, but his gaze shifted uncertainly between Tom and Kate. It was all the distraction Tom needed. He lunged forward, grabbing a nearby coffee pot and hurling it at Sal's hand. The scalding liquid hit its mark, causing Sal to cry out, dropping the gun. Tom moved quickly, closing the distance and delivering a swift punch to Sal's face, knocking him back against a table. In a final surge of rage, Sal swung blindly, but Tom blocked the blow, twisting Sal's arm behind his back and forcing him to his knees. Sal struggled, but Tom's grip was unyielding, his voice calm but laced with steel. "It's over, Sal. You don't own this town anymore." The sound of sirens filled the air as the police, alerted by a few brave bystanders, arrived at the scene. Officers rushed in, detaining Sal and his men one by one. As Sal was dragged away, he glared at Tom, spitting threats that faded as he was led out into the night. With the danger gone, Tom finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. The adrenaline faded, replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. Kate rushed to his side, her face pale but relieved. "Tom," she whispered, reaching out to touch his arm. "You did it. You saved us." He managed a weary smile, his gaze softening as he looked at her and David. "I didn't do it alone," he replied quietly. As the last of the officers cleared the scene, Tom looked around the diner, at the broken chairs and shattered glass, feeling a strange sense of peace amidst the wreckage. He had fought to protect the life he'd tried so hard to build, and though the road had been brutal, he knew he wouldn't trade it for anything. In that moment, as Kate and David stood by his side, Tom realized that he had finally found his place, not just in Bayview, but in the lives of those he cared about. The days following Sal Mancini's arrest brought an unfamiliar calm to Bayview. For the first time in years, local business owners felt safe. The shadow of extortion and violence finally lifted. Word of Tom Walsh's stand against Sal had spread quickly, and though Tom hadn't sought attention, he was now regarded as something of a hero. Despite the physical toll of the confrontation, Tom carried on, refusing to let his injuries hinder him. But as the adrenaline faded, he felt the weight of his choices, each bruise and cut a reminder of the cost of his past catching up with him. Kate was there through it all. She spent long hours at Tom's side, bringing him meals and helping him with even the smallest tasks as he healed. She understood his stubborn pride, yet her presence was unwavering, her patience boundless. As they sat together one evening in his small kitchen, Kate decided it was time to confront the unspoken truths between them. "Tom," she began gently, her eyes holding his with a quiet intensity, "I know this fight was personal, but it's not just the Mafia or this town. It's something deeper. Whatever's haunting you, maybe it's time to let it go. He looked at her, the usual guard in his expression softening. Kate, I've done things I'm not proud of, he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. As a CIA agent, I made choices that left scars on me and on others. I left that life hoping to find some kind of peace, but it always seems to find me. She reached across the table, her hand resting over his. You didn't have to protect this town, Tom, but you did. Whatever you did back then, it doesn't define you now. You're not that man anymore. Tom's gaze dropped, struggling with the emotions he'd kept buried for so long. I can't change what I've done, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I did something right. For you, for David, for all of us here. His voice was thick with emotion. And it matters more to me than I thought it could. Kate's eyes softened, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The unspoken feelings between them, the silent support and growing affection, finally found its way to the surface. She leaned closer, her voice a whisper. Then stay, Tom. Stay and let yourself be part of this place. Let us be here for you. Moved, Tom took her hand in his, feeling a warmth and belonging he had never thought possible. In that quiet moment, he knew his path was no longer one of solitude and shadows. With Kate and David in his life, he felt an unfamiliar sense of hope. As Tom's strength returned, so did the spirit of the town. Bayview's residents rallied together, working to repair the diner and remove the last remnants of Sal's influence. Business owners, grateful for their newfound freedom, offered their services and materials to restore the coastal refuge. Customers returned with renewed respect, their visits a testament to the community's support and resilience. Tom found himself surrounded by people who appreciated his courage, and with each passing day, he felt his connection to the town deepen. Kate and David became an essential part of his life. Tom grew close to the boy, who looked up to him with a child's admiration, seeing in Tom a strength and kindness he hadn't seen before. Tom, in turn, found himself protective of David, feeling a paternal instinct that surprised him. He spent evenings teaching David small self-defense techniques, subtly passing on the discipline and confidence he hoped would shield the boy from any future dangers. Their bond was undeniable, and it filled Tom with a sense of purpose he had long thought lost. The day came to reopen the diner, and the townspeople gathered to celebrate. A line of customers wrapped around the building, each one there to show their gratitude and support. Tom stood in front of the diner, looking out at the familiar faces, the sight of Kate and David among them giving him strength. As he welcomed everyone inside, he was met with handshakes, words of thanks, and even a few embraces. For a man who had lived so long in solitude, the show of support was overwhelming, but he accepted it, letting himself feel the warmth he'd so often denied himself. Kate approached him, her expression filled with pride and affection. "You did it, Tom. You protected us all," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He looked at her, his gaze warm. "I didn't do it alone. You were with me every step," he replied, a smile breaking through his usual reserve. They stood close, the bond between them stronger than ever, the lingering tension finally giving way to something more. At the end of the day, after the last of the customers had left, Tom, Kate, and David remained, sharing a quiet moment in the now restored diner. Tom felt a calm settle over him, a sense of rightness he hadn't known he was missing. He looked at Kate and David, feeling a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. Kate smiled at him, her eyes bright with gratitude and affection. "This is your place, Tom. You've made it that." And in that moment, Tom knew she was right. The darkness of his past no longer held him captive. He was free to live in the present, to build a life in Bayview. He had found not just peace, but purpose, and with Kate and David by his side, he knew he had finally come home. With Sal Mancini's control over Bayview broken, a new chapter began for Tom Walsh, but his journey was far from over. Determined to make something lasting from his skills and experiences, Tom saw an opportunity to give back to the town that had become his sanctuary. He transformed the back room of the coastal refuge into a modest self-defense training center, a place where residents could learn to protect themselves. The initiative, though small, was a gesture of empowerment, a way to shield the town from ever falling into the grip of another threat. The program attracted locals of all ages, from young adults eager to learn to elders who wanted to feel safe in their community. Tom taught classes twice a week, each session a blend of discipline and camaraderie. The lessons were more than just techniques. They became gatherings of resilience, a statement that Bayview would no longer be at the mercy of anyone seeking power through fear. And every class brought Tom closer to the community, solidifying his role as both protector and teacher. Kate and David attended every session. Kate's presence provided unwavering support, and David was quickly becoming one of Tom's most enthusiastic students. The boy's natural curiosity and eagerness to learn filled Tom with pride, and he found himself reliving moments of his own training, remembering the hope and determination that had once driven him. Tom sensed that David saw him as a mentor and perhaps something more, a father figure. The bond between them grew naturally, each lesson building trust and admiration that neither could ignore. As weeks passed, Tom's connection with Kate deepened as well. They spent more and more time together, sharing dinners, talking long into the night, and watching David grow in both strength and confidence. Kate became his confidant, the one person who knew the full extent of his past and still looked at him with acceptance and understanding. Tom's fears of judgment melted away in her presence, and for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future that didn't involve running or hiding. One crisp autumn evening, after a particularly intense training session, Tom found himself standing alone in the dimly lit diner, reflecting on how far he had come. The sounds of laughter and conversation from earlier in the day lingered in his mind, a comforting contrast to the solitude he had once embraced. As he was lost in thought, Kate approached quietly, her eyes warm as she watched him. "You know," she began, breaking the silence, "I think this place has become more than just a diner. It's a safe haven, a place where people can feel strong again." Her voice was soft, but there was pride in it. Tom smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "I never thought it would mean so much to me. This town, you, David, you've all given me something I never thought I'd find again." Kate took a step closer, reaching for his hand. "And you've given us more than you know, Tom." Her gaze held his, the depth of her feelings clear in the gentle way she looked at him. They stood in silence, the weight of their shared journey filling the space between them. Then, as if to seal the unspoken bond, Kate leaned in, her lips meeting his in a kiss that spoke of gratitude, trust, and the promise of a future they would build together. From that night forward, Tom felt a peace he had never known. His past no longer haunted him. It was simply a part of the man he had become, a man who had learned to protect without destroying, to build without running. And as his relationship with Kate blossomed, he realized he had not only found a new purpose but a new family. Months later, Tom hosted a community event at the coastal refuge, now a bustling hub of life and laughter. The diner was filled with locals, some chatting over coffee, others sharing stories of how the town had changed since Tom had taken his stand against Sal Mancini. The walls, once marked by vandalism, now held photos of Bayview's gatherings, events, and a few snapshots of Tom's self-defense classes. The once quiet diner was alive, filled with memories and a spirit of unity. As Tom moved through the crowd, he found himself stopping by David, who was busy showing off a few of the moves Tom had taught him. The boy looked up, his eyes bright with admiration. "Look, Tom, I've been practicing." Tom chuckled, ruffling David's hair. "You're a natural, kid. Keep it up, and I might be asking you for pointers soon." David grinned, and in that moment, Tom felt the fullness of what he had gained, a life rooted not in shadows, but in light, family, and a community he was proud to protect. As the night drew to a close, Kate joined him, standing by his side as they looked out at the diner filled with familiar faces. She leaned in close, her voice soft. "You've done it, Tom. You've built something real, something that matters." He took her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. I couldn't have done it without you. Without all of you." He paused, his gaze moving over the room, taking in the friends and family he had found in this once sleepy town. "This is home. For the first time, I know it's where I'm meant to be." They stood together, watching the townspeople laugh and share stories, the warmth of the evening wrapping around them. Tom knew his journey had finally led him here, to a place where he could lay down his burdens, to a life filled with purpose, belonging, and love. As he held Kate's hand, he felt the weight of his past lift completely, leaving him free to embrace the future that lay ahead, a future that was finally, truly his own.